It is 1941. Hitler's army has taken over much of Europe, and Britain is depending on convoys of supplies from North America. These convoys are threatened daily by German U-boats, and oftentimes the supplies don't reach their destination. Japan has been expanding its empire since 1930, adding territories such as Manchuria, large parts of China, and Southeast Asia. In an attempt to slow down the Japanese expansion, the United States stops all trade with Japan. The United States knows that war with Japan is unavoidable, but they were unprepared for how quickly it would start. It is December 7th, 1941, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, a seemingly normal day. Then, just before 8 o'clock, the unthinkable happened. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was such a shocking blow to the US that it forces America to declare war on Japan and Germany. As America plunges into the war, it will need men to fight in the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps. Resources like coal, oil, rubber, and steel to build and fuel ships, tanks, and army vehicles. But almost as important as building a capable army is gathering information about the enemy. An army of intelligence workers would need to be assembled, codes intercepted and deciphered. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American government had already begun to gather experts on cryptanalysis, which is the art of breaking codes. There were many challenges to recruiting codebreakers, one of which was the fact that most of the men suited for that type of work were going off to war. In the mid-1900s, women were either teachers, nurses, or secretaries, but most often, housewives. Few women went to college. Women's education wasn't a high priority, or even a priority at all. But with the need for information from the enemy, the army was left no choice but to resort to women. Letters were sent out to colleges such as Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Anne White received her letter from Helen Dodson, an American astronomer, asking her to come for an interview. When she arrived for her interview, Dodson only had 2 questions for her. Did she like crossword puzzles? And was she engaged to be married? In all, more than 20 Wellesley seniors had received these letters and been asked the same questions. After the letters had been sent out to many colleges, the students were called to a secret meeting and offered a training course to learn cryptanalysis. They were told that they could not mention their work to anyone, not their roommates, friends, or family. A lot of the women were hesitant about the secrecy aspect. They wanted to tell their loved ones what they were doing to help the war effort. They had to lie about their jobs, convincing people that they were secretaries. Those who accepted were recruited initially as civilians, as opposed to military personnel. Later on, they were brought into the Women's Army Corps and the U.S. Navy as waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Of course, not all women were chosen for this work. The military wanted single, bright, willing to keep a secret, and American-born women. The military avoided foreign-born citizens in fear that they could be associated with the enemy. There were 2 women in particular that had already done a great service in code breaking. Those women were Agnes Meyer Driscoll and Elizabeth Smith Friedman. By the time World War II broke out, Agnes Driscoll already had a lot of experience in cryptology. She had joined the U.S. Navy in 1918 during World War I. She started out working as a stenographer, but her education in languages, physics, and math provided her with the opportunity to move into the code and signal section. While she was there, she helped to develop the communications machine, the main machine that the U.S. Navy used to encode its communications in the 1920s. Along with Lieutenant Joseph Rochefort, she broke a Japanese Navy manual code known as the Red Book Code. Then, in 1939, she made progress on the important Japanese code, JN-25. The other remarkable codebreaker was Elizabeth Smith Friedman. Elizabeth started codebreaking when she was recruited by an eccentric wealthy man named George Fabian, who ran a private research laboratory called Riverbank. She was recruited to help prove that Shakespeare's literature was written instead by Francis Bacon. That project had proved to be a failure, but when the U.S. entered World War I, Fabian's crew was asked by the US government to contribute to cracking enemy codes. While she was at Riverbank, Elizabeth met and later married William F. Friedman, who would also become a famous cryptanalyst. After Elizabeth and William Friedman left Riverbank, she was recruited by the US Coast Guard to crack the codes of organized crime during Prohibition. She single-handedly cracked all of their codes, amounting to about 12,000 messages, allowing the government to arrest the criminals. After that, she went on to work for the US Navy, helping to crack the Enigma code. In the early stages of the war, the US military was very understaffed to contend with the enemy communications being intercepted. In January of 1941, the Naval Codebreaking Unit only amounted to about 60 people. By mid-1942, the Naval Codebreaking Unit had already grown to 720 people and was increasing by the day. At the Naval Communications Annex in Washington, D.C., the peak number of women codebreakers was 4,000, and women made up 80% of the total codebreaking force for the Navy. At the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Army only had 181 people working for its codebreaking force. By 1945, the Army had 10,500 people on the codebreaking force, and nearly 70% of that number were female. The importance of what these women did shouldn't go unnoticed. They took part in stressful, difficult, and tedious work to help our country. The women knew that if they failed to crack a code, men would die. This knowledge was a constant burden to them, and they felt like they were responsible for their lives. One codebreaker named Margaret Gilman states, "Can you imagine sending out American troop ships loaded with soldiers through an Atlantic Ocean riddled with submarines? It was heartrending. Oh my God." Where Margaret worked, there was a large map with the known locations of German U-boats and Allied ships. She avoided looking at the map, for she didn't want to see when a ship had been lost or when a convoy was going into an area where they hadn't been able to find out the enemy U-boat positions. Some American commanders were skeptical of cryptanalysis being used in the war. They believed that it was too slow to be useful. But when they saw the victories that resulted from cryptanalysis, they thought differently. In 1939, the codebreakers cracked a cipher called the Purple Code, which was the Japanese diplomatic code. Purple was used to encrypt messages sent between Tokyo and its embassies around the world. President Roosevelt and the commanders were impressed, and they now relied on this for their information. One of the great successes of the codebreaking service was the Battle of Midway Island. In mid-May 1942, the American codebreakers intercepted a message saying that the Japanese were going to attack a target they called AF. The codebreakers thought that AF likely stood for Midway, which was a small island where the United States had a base. Midway was crucial to defend Hawaii and to maintain a presence in the Pacific. Some codebreakers thought that AF was Hawaii or some other island, so they made a plan. They told the men at Midway to send out a non-coded message explaining that Midway was short on water. They knew the Japanese would intercept it, and when they did, the Americans deciphered a message from the Japanese saying that AF was short on water. They now knew that AF stood for Midway. Thanks to cryptanalysis, they were able to set up defenses protecting Midway from the Japanese attack. Without the women codebreakers, the US wouldn't have had the advantage of information, which allowed them to know the enemy's movements before they happened. Once the war had finally ended, a lot of them had to go back to their normal lives and roles in society. But it had been shown that women were highly capable of performing difficult and technical jobs. While it would be decades before women would achieve true equality in the workplace, women codebreakers had shown that they could be more than wives or teachers. In spite of their heroic achievements, these women continued to keep their work confidential. Even now, what these women accomplished for the war is just being fully recognized. Their contribution in the war was vital for the Allies' success, and they faced unimaginable challenges that deserve to be remembered.